Lois, we just heard that scripture from Galatians 2, verse 16, that by the works of the flesh shall no man be justified. Mm-hmm. Now, Paul labors it there, and in chapter 3 of Galatians, he goes on to talk about being justified by faith, which is the basis of this whole understanding of Christianity. Mm-hmm. So you see that in Bunyan's case, we have these guys in his church, and they're listening to the pastor, a man named Mr. Gifford, who's a very good man, and in our story, he's really the evangelist, probably. Okay. But they're not getting the message. And sometimes when you're being plain with people, like we try to be here, or even in church when you're speaking, you can be as plain as vanilla with people about that not being justified by works. And what's the first thing they want to do when they talk to you? They want to be justified by works. They want to say, we're really good. Mm-hmm. We do all these things right. Mm-hmm. And the true Christian's humble enough to know that even the best things he does are tainted with selfishness or pridefulness or anger, But most of the world's religions, aside from Christianity, are really boasting about works. If you think about it, in Islam, nothing could be more works-oriented. Right. Somehow you have merit because of what you do, and that God owes you somehow. Mm-hmm. Well, there's just no basis for it. All that we do is done by grace. Christ living in us. Paul is clear on it. Right. But it's very difficult for human nature to be clear on it because we want something to boast about. Now, let me ask you this. See if this makes any sense to you. He comes to the hypocrite and formalist are still there. And he says to him, save these two men told Christians to come to the laws and their behavior. They said to him, well, it looks like our behavior might even be superior to yours. Mm-hmm. And you had mentioned that to me before, that you know what that means.
Right. Well, I think coming from a perspective of being more of a hypocrite myself, you put a lot of emphasis on trying to outwardly do the list of whatever it is in your mind that you must do. So you're so much focused on that instead of being in love with Christ and being in a relationship. I'm doing a lot of stuff. So if I was sitting next to you in a church situation, I would have a whole lot more stacked up on looking like a better
Christian.
Righteous, yes. Like a better Christian, I don't know who's measuring, which would be very hard, because I need to compare to you anyway. That makes me feel better anyway. So it's good to sit next to you, because I would feel better about myself being next to you, because you're probably
especially if I'm a person with a troubled conscience.
Right.
Like Bunyan found himself in church all the time, and he would assess himself to be a failure at so many of the Christian duties and graces.
Right.
Well, then the person sitting next to him, they like it because Bunyan was always ready to admit his shortcomings.
Exactly.
And the hypocrite, the one thing that you can always spot about a hypocrite is they don't know their own shortcomings.
No.
They don't see them.
They don't see them, nor can they afford to see them.
That's the key.
Right.
It's that idea that they're so identified with their bright and shiny exterior.
Exactly.
That if you question that bright and shiny exterior, they'll erupt in anger, and you're surprised at the degree of anger, the intensity of it. But really it's because their whole being is hinged and tied to that idea that I'm a really wonderful person. Now, they miss the fact that God hated Pharisees.
Right.
And that God, when he was walking the earth, said, you're full of dead men's bones. And that God, when he said, I see your heart, not just your externals. Your externals are for men. God looks upon the heart.
I did a study in Matthew, and I was just so overwhelmed with Christ's attitude in response to the hypocrites. He had no time for them. He tried to make things complicated for them. It was so disgusting to him. And it was like, ooh.
Well, in this story, it gets disgusting. What ends up happening is these guys finally tease our hero and say, no offense, not only are we better at this, but the only coat you have is the coat that was given you. You said so yourself.
Right.
To cover your nakedness. Then he says this moving thing about, the Lord of the place, I think when I see him again, he'll treat me kindly, knowing that he gave me this coat. He took my rags of righteousness and gave me real righteousness, his robe. And I think he'll remember that he gave it to me. Very moving, beautiful scene in Bunyan's mind. Now, what ends up happening is Bunyan leaves these men. He speaks to himself, sometimes sighingly, sometimes comfortably. They're chattering away very confidently. And then they come to the place called the Hill of Difficulty. And there's a path that leads up over the hill, a path to the left that leads into a woods, and a path to the right that leads into some mountains. And Bunyan pictures this hill of difficulty. Remember, he's really just left the cross. And he decides to climb up the hill of difficulty, which signifies the Christian life is going to be difficult. The formalist says, well, I'll just meet you on the other side. He goes into the woods, is never heard of again. The woods is called the woods of danger. And this side is the woods of meaning the mountains of destruction. And this guy goes through the field and into the mountains of destruction, and he stumbles and is lost forever. And Bunyan, the climb gets so difficult for Christian that he has to get on his hands and knees and climb up over the hill of difficulty. And the other side going down is difficult. And that's the Christian life. So when you hear somebody like Joel Osteen or one of those sorts of TV guys telling you that the Christian life is just nothing but blessing from beginning to end, not only is he a liar, but he just is somebody who completely misunderstands the Scripture and can't have any sense of history. Because if you look at Christ's life, does this look like a life of luxury? If the king himself has to scramble and be tortured and thirst and live in poverty and be devoid of all the daily comforts, then so that what? You can be, they'll quote you a verse saying he was made poor so that you might be rich. It has nothing to do with anything but worldly goods in their mind. And it's such a terrible distortion of the Scripture. Obviously it has to do with spiritual goods.
Exactly. That's the thing that goes on.
So we've gotten through the formalist and the hypocrite, and they're both now dead, and our heroes scramble up over the mountain, and it's difficult. But guess what? He's leaving now the hill of difficulty, and he's headed towards real trouble. We'll catch up.
Great.
Well, Lois, we're coming down to the end of this show. And instead of going on with our hero at this moment, I wanted you to think about something. I'd written myself a little note that I'd passed over, that right after the cross, we, in the Christian experience, just like in Bunyan's life, we tend to run into difficulties. You know, and I had a little thing here. Difficulties and afflictions display the difference between believers and unbelievers. See, God puts you to the test. Remember, if God's in control of everything, even if your enemies look like they're putting you to the test, God's behind it, permitting it, or initiating it. Now, God often brings difficulties into our lives, or permits difficulties in our lives. Why? It proves your faith, or disproves your faith. What happens in Bunyan's life when the difficulties come? His wife dies. His best friend, his pastor, dies in the same year. He has a blind daughter. He has 3 other children. And little does he know it now, God's going to reward him by
sending him to prison.
Within 5 years. He will be in prison. And he will be there for 12 years. And then he'll go back for a few months even after that. Now, it might look to people who are just formalists like God mistreats his children. But what really happens is when you have afflictions in your life, and you may have troubles now, if you really are a Christian, you should understand that God refines you through afflictions. That these things are painful, no doubt about it. These things are frightening. But they're meant to trim away your love for this world, to root out all of your pridefulness, whatever else is wrong with you. God knows what's wrong with you, and the afflictions come. And if you're an unbeliever posing as a believer, afflictions will make you get up, pack your bags, and go. You'll be done with God. because He permits these things to happen
It's
to you.
unfair.
It just seems unfair. You're done with it. You have no confidence in Him. And so instead of your faith being tested and refined like pure gold, where the bad parts get separated from the gold, as a believer, your faith is shown to be exactly what it is, which is pure dross. It's no good at all. There is no gold in it. You shouldn't have been in the church, and you shouldn't have been calling yourself a Christian. You need now to go through the wicket gate, and you need to do what Bunyan was doing and find your way to Christ. I don't care if you've been in church for 40 years. I don't care if you've been the preacher in the church for 40 years. If you don't understand that principle, you certainly are misunderstanding the gospel and misunderstanding the Bible. I had written this other thing, and I'm just going to close with this, Lois. Difficulties designed to draw us near in love. And the reason I'm saying that is, your difficulties draw you near to whom?
Well, to Christ.
To Christ.
Yeah.
And they get rid of what? Self-dependence and self-righteousness. Mm-hmm. Now we're going to close, and I just want to thank you. You work on getting rid of your self-righteousness, and I'll work on getting rid of mine. I love you, little girl, and we'll see you guys next week.
For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb, and I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made in my mother's womb. I was never hid from you long before you ordained my days for me, before I ever came to be. How precious to me are all your thoughts, oh God. I fall asleep seeking to number them, for they are more than all the grains of sand.